I'll start the live now.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for our Food for Thought seminar. My name is Sophie Watson, and I'm part of the Food for Thought team. Before I introduce you to today's speakers, I'd like to remind you of some housekeeping rules. Since we're on Teams Live, you won't be able to unmute your microphones to ask questions or to have your video on. We do, however, welcome any questions or comments that you may have, and you can post these into the Q&A chat box, which should appear at the right of your screen. Please note that any questions will be picked up at the end of the presentation. Today's seminar is being recorded and the seminar recording will be circulated in due course. For today's seminar, I'd like to provide a very warm welcome to Helen Heard and Darren Bhattachary. They're here today to present on FSA's award-winning Kitchen Life 2 research, which was published earlier this month. Helen is a Senior Social Science Research Officer at the Food Standards Agency. She joined the FSA Social Science team in February 2020 and has delivered a variety of research projects ranging from quick turnaround surveys to policy-specific, high-profile multi-method projects. Recently, Helen has led on the FSA's Consumer Insights Tracker survey, as well as the Kitchen Life 2 project that she'll be talking about today. Before joining the FSA, Helen worked as an analyst in the Department of Health and Social Care and has an academic background in sociology and social psychology. Darren is the co-founder and CEO of Basis Social and has led the Kitchen Life 2 project. He has previously been the UK CEO of Kantar Insights Division and Executive Director of Kantar Public. He set up Basis Social in 2021 to help bring fresh ideas to social research. He has a wealth of experience of working on behavioural insights, behaviour change, and has worked extensively on food systems. In various roles, he's worked with the FSA since 2006. So without further ado, and from all of us at the Food for Thought team, we hope you enjoy, and I'll now pass over to Helen and Darren to begin their presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sophie. That was quite the introduction. So yeah, hi everybody and welcome. My name's Helen, as Sophie mentioned, and today we're going to be exploring food safety behaviours in real life kitchens from the Kitchen Life 2 study. And I had an introduction planned, but I don't think I need to do it. So obviously I'm here with Darren from Basis Social. Darren, is it worth you coming on just to say hello and I suppose check that the mic is working?
You probably can hear me rather than see me, but hello, I'm Darren. Oh, you can see me now. Hi, I'm Darren. I'll be talking through some wonderful case studies shortly. Thank you, Helen.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. So I thought it'd be really helpful to start today's session with a very brief overview of Kitchen Life 2, what the project is, why we conducted this research, and what we're using it for. So many of you may not have heard of Kitchen Life 2 before, and that's great because you've come to a session all about it. So Kitchen Life 2 used motion sensitive cameras to capture real life behaviour as it occurs in 101 kitchens. So that is 70 households and 31 food business kitchens. We also captured data using food diaries, shopping receipts, photographs of fridges and surveys and interviews as well. And this was all to understand what behaviours are going on in these kitchens. So what people are really doing, and it's helping us to understand questions like how long do people really wash their hands for? What do people actually do with their leftovers? Do they put them in the fridge or do they leave them out on the side for hours on end? How do business kitchens manage cross-contamination in the workplace? So all of these different things, this is why we originally established the study. But Kitchen Life also, it does go beyond what people are doing, and it also uses a behavioural framework to understand why people behave in this way. So the FSA are exploring the findings from this study already to consider how we can use them in the following ways. So that is to support our risk assessments, to support our policy making, to inform our communication strategy, and hopefully to inform our consumer and business guidance as well. any future behavioural interventions research that we're going to be conducting at the FSA will hopefully be informed by the findings of Kitchen Life 2 as well. So obviously behavioural interventions research is more about kind of, if we know what people are doing and why they're doing it, how can we try to improve that behaviour in the future? So I'm going to talk through a lot of the details about how we conducted this research. And then, as Darren mentioned, he's going to take over and talk through some of the case studies and some of the more interesting findings from the research as well. So let's start right back at the beginning, as all good stories do, with the scoping and development stages of the project. So we began with a literature review, and this was conducted with our partners at Leeds University Business School, who may be on the call today, actually. So thank you to them for their contributions to this research. Now, the literature review was conducted to understand what was already available with regards to food safety behaviours in households and business kitchens. But due to the limited number of research papers available at the time that the literature review was conducted, because it was conducted during the COVID-19 pandemic, it was also supplemented with in-depth interviews, and these were carried out with experts in food safety from the FSA and also in academia as well. So following the literature review, we then went on to design the research study, and this included development of the recruitment, data collection planning, thinking about how we would store, analyse and manage all of the data from the study. And at this stage, we also carefully considered the representation of the type of kitchens that would be included. So it was really important for us that we had a range of kitchens available to us in the study so that we could get a diverse range of backgrounds. So this included demographics in households from a variety of backgrounds, but also from the businesses as well. So gathering data in takeaways, and we even had a school included as well in the end. So obviously then we did conduct a very detailed ethical review. So this was to really think about the issues such as consent, any risks that we might be posing to participants by being included in this research, and to really consider any mitigations we could put against those to reduce the risks. So we did a detailed project impact assessment, which also considered legal and other GDPR considerations, and we had to think about potentially any risk that could occur, including the possibility of observing harm in real life. So we also thought about things like the legal basis for the research, how breaches might be handled if there were any data leaks, and all of these things were documented and recorded in great detail. A lot more information is available about this in our technical report, if that is of interest to anybody on the call today. And then finally, we were ready to start filming. So our pilot study started in June 2021. And this began with 2 household kitchens and 2 food business kitchens. And the pilot helped us to test the whole process from sending out the cameras and recruiting the kitchens all the way through to returning the cameras at the end. And this gave us a variety of lessons learned that we could apply to the main stages of fieldwork. Okay, so when we moved into the main fieldwork stages, we actually conducted the study across 5 waves. So we went into field and filmed, and then we took a pause, and then went into field again, took a pause. Some of the waves overlapped slightly, but generally it was conducted over 5 different waves. And these were between July 2021 and October 2022. Conducting the study in this way, in the waves, allowed us to manage the practicalities of distributing cameras, recruiting, which was particularly difficult, especially in FBOs. But it also allowed us to film across a broader range of seasons. So we were able to capture data, for example, on the type of food preparation that occurs in summer versus the type of food preparation that might be occurring in the winter, like roast dinner, for example. So each kitchen had a camera, and a thermometer installed into the fridge and freezer. And we filmed and measured temperature data for between 5 and 7 days in each kitchen, and 3 days per kitchen of data were coded and analysed. So overall, this was around, or just over actually, 290,000 data labels applied to over 650 hours of footage. So an enormous data set that was manually coded up. Each of the data labels that we applied corresponded to a food behaviour and its context. So for example, codes were applied to who was in the kitchen, the type of utensils they were using, the appliance that they were using in the kitchen, and the type of food that they were preparing. That's just some examples of the type of labels that were applied. And quantifying the data in this way allows the FSA now and in the future to search through all of this data and to analyse it in new and different ways. So we can see how many times behaviours occurred, and also each behaviour was time-stamped. So we can see how long it takes someone to, for instance, wash their hands or conduct one behaviour and then another. The video footage was also analysed qualitatively. So as I mentioned before, we used a behavioural framework called COM-B to explore people's behaviour and understand why they were behaving in the way that they did. And I'll explain a little bit more about that process on the next slide. The data that we captured from the fridge and freezer thermometers, that is a tongue twister. The data that we captured there was explored quantitatively. So first of all, it was cleaned to remove any potential erroneous data. So particularly when the thermometer was first installed into the fridge, we know that it took some time to adjust to the new temperature. So the first sort of a reasonable amount of time, we would delete that data and then start monitoring from then onwards. So that type of cleaning took place. And then this allowed us to understand the minimum and maximum temperatures that fridge and freezers were operating at, and also allowed us to assess average temperatures over the filming period. We also used surveys, photographs, food diaries, and shopping receipts to understand the wider context of what was occurring in these kitchens. So particularly the interviews and surveys were really insightful for us to understand what participants were thinking or feeling during the time that we were filming in their kitchen. We were also able to ask them questions about their knowledge, which is obviously difficult to capture on camera. So this allows us to compare how people behave in real life from the footage, but also in comparison, how they actually think, feel or know about that topic. So just very briefly, for anybody that's not familiar, I thought it'd be helpful to provide an overview of the COM-B model and how this can be applied to analysing people's behaviour, which is exactly what we did when we were analysing the video footage. So COM-B helps you is a structured way of helping you think about how and why people behave. And the model COM-B stands for capability, opportunity, and motivation, each of these influencing B behaviour. So this example on the screen talks about the example of hand washing and how the model can be applied to a hand washing behaviour. So capability, first of all, this refers to your ability to do the behaviour. So this is both physically and psychological capability. So for example, in the case of hand washing, participants need to be able to physically move their hands, turn on taps, use a soap dispenser to do correct hand washing practices. So that's an example of physical capability. But psychological capability refers to their knowledge or understanding about why hand washing is important or the need to do this. Motivation refers to your motivation to do something, and it can be reflective or automatic. So reflective motivation, first of all, is about your beliefs or values, such as believing that not washing your hands won't hurt you, or the belief that germs are good for you. This might influence whether or not you're actually willing to wash your hands. Automatic motivation refers to habits or unconscious thoughts or unconscious actions. So, for example, always washing your hands before you eat because you've always done it that way and you do it without thinking. That would be an example of automatic motivation. Opportunity refers to the environment or factors outside of the individual that influence the behaviour. So physical opportunity might be related to hand washing facilities being within reach, so you can access them. But social opportunity might relate to the general culture or attitude to hand washing in the workplace, for example, whether or not people just generally do it and it is a part of the culture where you work. So each of these factors interact, but the COM-B model helps us to understand that while somebody might have a good knowledge about hand washing, for instance, or they might have access to facilities to wash their hands, their behaviour might be influenced by other factors, like their beliefs, whether or not they actually want to do that practice. So by understanding these various different factors, we can also think about changing people's behaviour in more suitable ways. So that's a whistle-stop tour of how we conducted Kitchen Life 2 and some of the analysis approaches that we used when looking at the data. And I'm going to hand over to Darren, who will talk in more detail about some of the findings and some really interesting case studies that we have from the research. Okay.
Thank you, Helen. So to the main course, as it were. I'm going to take you through some case studies. And the first is to introduce Sarah. So Sarah, I interviewed her. She lived in a semi-rural village with a partner, Ian. She also had an 11-year-old daughter. Sarah was tired, man. I mean, she works very, very long hours. That includes day shifts and night shifts, and she often feels exhausted from work. So Sarah tries to keep on top of kitchen chores, but her job and her tiredness really make this hard. And she said to me, if I'm really busy, I tend to let things slide. So overall, Sarah wants her house to feel homely, relaxed and comfortable. And she also believes that having a bit of mess in the kitchen is absolutely fine. So Sarah enjoys cooking, and she's also got a really good understanding of food risks, as she used to work in catering, and she's undertaken level 2 food hygiene training. So, for example, she knows that touching raw meat is a risk during food preparation. And during her interview, she notes the importance of washing her hands, both on the front and the back, with soap for at least 20 seconds as good practice. But despite this knowledge, Sarah describes her personal approach to risk as a bit more relaxed. And she describes food hygiene as being not massively important to me. I remember her saying things like, I like to make sure surfaces are clean, and I kind of wash my hands out of habit, but I don't really think of things beyond that. So on one occasion, Sarah is cooking a chicken stir fry, and she's cooking raw chicken from scratch. So she cuts some vegetables and she puts them into a pan to fry. And then she uses the same knife and the same chopping board to chop the raw chicken breast. She seems very tired and she's very absent-minded during this preparation process. She then uses the same hand that she's handled raw chicken to touch a frying pan and then open a fridge door and then hold a different knife handle. And none of these surfaces are observed to be wiped. She then does wash her hands. It lasts for 7 seconds and she washes it with washing up liquid and hot water. I would describe the washing as a light rinse rather than a thorough clean. Sarah then shakes her hands off to dry and continues to cook the meal. So that's one instance amongst the 200 and how many hours, 400 and how many hours of footage that we looked at, sorry. So what can we say about Sarah's behaviour in that context? So it's clear that Sarah understands the importance of hand washing to manage risks of foodborne illness. I mean, I think she gave a textbook answer on how to wash hands with soap during the interviews, front, back, with soap, duration, and so on. Her knowledge absolutely enables washing hands with soap after touching raw meat, fish, and poultry. So psychological capability in that context really wasn't a factor. Other things were influencing the behaviour. So specifically, according to her interview, Sarah believes that hand washing practices after touching raw meat, fish, and poultry are really habitual. So automatic motivation is a big factor there. And our habits involve a mixture of hand washing with soap and rinsing hands, and also Sarah being really tired whilst cooking the meal. She actually prepared it quite late at night. So it's a very much absent-minded behaviour. She touches a variety of kitchen items before washing her hands with soap, and it's this kind of habitual, I'll wash a bit at the beginning, and then these absent-minded tiredness and habits that get in the way of washing hands with soap after each occasion when she touches raw meat, fish, and poultry. So that's Sarah. I'm now going to just talk a bit about some of the other things we found when looking about hand washing habits when preparing meat, fish, and poultry. The first is that people often rinsed rather than washed their hands with soap. So only around 40% of food preparation occasions in both households and businesses involved someone washing their hands with soap when they were preparing meat, fish, and poultry. Quite interestingly, when people did wash their hands with soap, on average, it lasted quite a bit longer in households, so about 16 seconds, than in FBOs, where the average time was 11 seconds. 1 in 4 households didn't wash their hands with soap during a preparation occasion where meat, fish, and poultry was being prepared for up to 45 minutes during our observations. We also found that not washing hands after handling meat, fish, and poultry was most likely to occur on Sunday afternoons or evenings in households, probably linked to the Sunday roast, or on Friday at lunch or in the evenings in FBOs. So again, those types of peak hours. More generally, what we found in terms of hand washing is that there was no kind of perfect behaviours or absolutely bad behaviours. So there was no perfect saint or perfect sinner. For the majority of participants, there were occasions when hand washing with soap when preparing meat, fish, and poultry was observed, but these were intersped with occasions of rinsing and not washing, which then brings us to our ideas for interventions. So one of the big issues we observed in households was this tendency to multitask. People would start prepping something, get it distracted, do something else, go and grab the pan, reach for the fridge, and so on and so forth. So they might often wash their hands with soap at some point, but then believe it had these magical powers that would, persist for forevermore. So consequently, what we thought that for households, behavioural interventions should be really trying to get people to focus on preparing raw meat, fish, and poultry as a single task, rather than this multitasking behaviour, and to establish the need to wash hands with soap immediately after this. FBOs were slightly different. And behavioural interventions really need to be alongside interventions to prevent the reuse of tea towels on cloths. We'll come on to this in a minute, but tea towels in particular had this kind of totemic power in food businesses. Chefs carried it over their shoulder. It was a signal of them as the gladiator of the kitchen almost. It had this kind of very symbolic type role, and consequently the fact it was on your shoulder or around your waist meant it was very easy and physically available to wipe your hands on a tea towel rather than wash them, and that was the behaviour that we needed to get at. Okay, on which note we are going to turn to the wonderful world of tea towels, an innocuous kitchen item which harbours dark secrets. So this is Justin. Justin works in finance. He lives in his 40s with his wife Mel, and he's got 2 young kids. So again, Justin's and Mel's lives are busy. They weren't actually as busy as Sarah's, but they thought they were busy nonetheless. They loved cooking, but they did struggle to find the time to plan meals properly. Justin has these kind of ambivalent beliefs around food hygiene and food safety. So on the one hand, he believes a bit of dirt even won't hurt you, and is good for the immune system. but he's also very concerned about preparing raw meat, fish and poultry due to the potential risk of food poisoning for his kids. So in terms of cloths and tea towels, they've got several in the kitchen and they are used for a wide variety of purposes. This was observed to be things like holding hot handles while cooking, wiping surfaces, wiping children's faces and drying crockery. Justin says that reusing tea towels for multiple purposes is not hygienic, but he also admits to not really being conscious about how he uses tea towels when cooking. And overall, he believes he manages this risk because he washes tea towels frequently. So on one occasion, Justin is busy preparing dinner for the kids. He's got a tea towel in his hand and he's wiping down some dishes and surfaces as he cooks. And then in addition to wiping surfaces, at one point it uses the same tea towel to pick up some raw fish from the package. I'm unclear why he does this. So is Justin. When I asked him in the interview, he had no recollection whatsoever of doing it. When Justin is serving dinner, he drops some food on the floor and he uses a J cloth to wipe the floor and the food up before returning the J cloth to the sink. The J cloth's not washed and later it's used to wipe down a surface. Mel comes in a bit later on after dinner and she helps to clean up. And she uses the tea towel that was previously used by Justin to handle raw fish to start to wipe down the kitchen surfaces and a recipe card. On other meal occasions, Mel is also observed to use tea towels and cloths for multiple purposes, though not as frequently as Justin. So what can we say about the behaviour? So Justin, again, knows about the risks of cross-contamination, but those tea towels and cloths are convenient, they're out and they're available for reuse. And being so close to hand, it makes physical opportunity a big factor driving the behaviour. So Justin often was distracted when using the item and was doing it very unconsciously. Social norms could well influence Justin behaviours. Mel was observed to reuse tea towels and cloths on meal occasions. And the risks around the items reused were not really observed to be as discussed by them in the kitchen. So lots of things going on there. What can we say more generally about tea towels and cloths? Well, they were used ubiquitously in kitchens. 69 out of the 70 households they were observed to be using, and for all of the 31 food businesses. They were used for a wide variety of purposes, obvious uses like wiping kitchen items like utensils and pans, surfaces, mopping up spilt foods and liquids and so on. Less frequently and also less obviously, they were used for other purposes. This includes wiping shoes, wiping faces, and even wiping other body parts, which I can't get into as it's before the watershed. So tea towels and cloths were generally not observed to be washed after such uses or in between uses. So despite what we saw from Justin earlier, people rarely wiped raw meat, fish and poultry directly with a tea towel or cloth. However, in over 40% of all meat, fish, poultry preparation occasions in households, it also involved them, rather than washing, wiping their hands on a tea towel or cloth. And as mentioned earlier, with FBOs, this was much higher, 80% of occasions. Again, that was due to the availability of the cloth on the shoulder. So when thinking about interventions, it's this kind of habitual and unthinking use of tea towels together with their physical availability that make the behaviours really challenging to address. One thing that did cut through these habits were sensorial cues, such as a towel feeling a bit wet or a cloth feeling a bit wet, and particularly when it smelled. And it was felt that could we begin to leverage some of these yuck factors, these sensorial cues, to associate the need to replace a tea towel or cloth when it was feeling wet or beginning to smell. And given that most households had several tea towels or cloths about in the kitchen, their use also could be used for specific tasks. So it's this idea of having an abundance of towels, making them used a bit more specifically and changing them when they start to feel damp or smell. Similarly, in FBOs, interventions could focus on using a clean or a new cloth or changing a cloth after each use, because again, there's an abundance of these lying around. It was also felt that FSA guidance could be improved in this area. So the last one I'm going to take you through is fridges, onto the world of fridges. This is my good friend Carlos, a very lovely man. So Carlos worked in restaurants all of his life. He's now semi-retired, and he decided during his semi-retirement to set up a small cafe with his partner, Sophia. So he established the cafe because he says he's really passionate about food and also to supplement the income from his pension. The cafe makes things like coffees and drinks, smoothies, milkshakes, sandwiches, and so on. And he describes the cafe as a popular place to hang out. So food hygiene is really important to Carlos. That's what he says. But as the cafe doesn't really have many raw foods, he believes risks are minimal. The cafe does have a deli counter, and he uses a range of cured meats. In terms of fridges, Carlos believes that keeping food at the right temperature is very important for safety. In the interview, Carlos believes that the correct temperature for a fridge is to be about 6 degrees Celsius and about minus 18 degrees Celsius for a freezer. So from the temperature readings from our probe in his fridge, Carlos's fridge actually ran at an average temperature of 7.2 degrees Celsius across the filming period, with a minimum of 6.1 degrees Celsius and a maximum of 8 degrees. Carlos said the fridge has a thermometer, which he claims that he checks from time to time. What he said every couple of days, but we didn't really observe this during observations. And while formal records are not kept, he notes during his interviews that the fridge temperature does fluctuate, but Carlos puts this down to a hot summer. And he's also not really that concerned about this from a food safety perspective, as overall it's around the right temperature. And he does not alter the fridge temperature settings in response to changes in the weather. So what can we say about Carlos's and his behaviour? Well, the first relate to psychological capability. He actually doesn't know the safe operating temperature of a fridge, which he understands as 6 degrees. It's actually recommended to keep it at 5 degrees or below. He does not have set routines for monitoring fridge temperatures. And whilst he claims to check every few days, we didn't observe that. So this lack of routine, together with a lack of knowledge, he also didn't have an alarm on his fridge. All of these things enable the behaviour. And whilst Carlos understands there is a risk from running a fridge too warm, he just puts this down to natural variations and the warm summer weather. So that even when Carlos knows that the fridge temperature is quite high, his motivation to act on that knowledge is pretty limited. So that's Carlos. More generally, when we looked at our fridge and freezer data, what we found is that the average temperature for all of the households in our sample was about 5.3 degrees Celsius. 34 out of the 65 households had an average fridge temperature greater than the 5 degrees Celsius recommended maximum during the fieldwork period, and 8 households had an average temperature of more than 8 degrees Celsius, and at that temperature the potential for bacterial growth is significantly elevated. In FBOs, the temperature across the filming period was 4.3 degrees C on average. 8 out of 29 of the FBOs had an average fridge temperature greater than 5 degrees Celsius, and 1 had an average temperature greater than the 8 degrees maximum. So these findings might look shocking. I was quite shocked when I looked at them. I actually wondered if we had a problem with the probes. But on further inspection, these reflect other research in the area. So, for example, some of the work of Ellen Evans and Elizabeth Redmond in Cardiff, who've conducted other research on temperature studies in domestic refrigerators. When we tried to understand what was going on in terms of the behaviour, so in households, what we generally found was that fridge temperatures, once they were set, they generally weren't really thought about again. Quite a lot of people actually didn't have alarms or built-in thermometers into the appliance. So behavioural interventions could potentially focus on easier ways to monitor and change the fridge temperature, One idea was the use of things like inexpensive liquid crystal thermometers that change colour above a threshold temperature and could help, nudge people when there was a problem. In FBOs, interventions really needed to focus much more around compliance by emphasising or strengthening a requirement to undertake daily record checks on fridges, and also the need to act if that temperature is too high. Right, I think that was all I was going to cover, and Helen is going to take us through some more chapters. So back to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Darren. Yeah, I really just enjoy that the case studies bring everything to life in such a real way. And of course they do, because they're real people that took part in the study. But they kind of really give it this flavour. So that was just 3 of the 7 chapters that we have published for Kitchen Life 2. So we don't have time to go through all 7, you'll be pleased to know today. But very briefly, I will just let you know about the other 4 that you can read about on our website. So the creation of food waste. So this chapter, by its title, explores how people create food waste, particularly with regards to food preparation. So in households, we found that individuals generally had a lack of skill for planning ahead, and they found it difficult to judge things like portion sizes. So particularly when they were adapting recipes, scaling up or down to feed their family, this was problematic in terms of creating food waste. They also found it hard to have enough time to plan and prepare meals. I'm sure we can probably all relate to that issue. But also some people found it difficult to have the space to store food, with all of these different factors contributed to food waste. But interestingly, there was a tension between food waste and food safety. So individuals they wanted to prevent food waste, but they also found it difficult to use up food in advance of the use by date. So the chapter focuses mostly around how we might be able to support people to think more upstream. So when they're planning, shopping, way in advance of the use by date, trying to support people in that regard to help plan and prevent food waste later down the line. Generally, in businesses, they were very good at managing food waste. They had good plans, they managed their menus, and they rotated stock to prevent food waste. And in FBOs, food waste was associated very much with wasting money. So this was a really big factor for them and a huge motivator to prevent it. The culture was also a significant factor. So many food businesses had policies in place to prevent food waste, or some of them even had accreditations which they associated with their brand about being a more sustainable business. So the report looks at wider literature available on this topic, because our cameras were only able to monitor the food preparation processes. So obviously what we think is happening is that actually in a food business setting, for example, a lot of the food waste occurs once the consumer receives the food. So in a restaurant, perhaps the food isn't eaten, or maybe in a takeaway setting, it's taken home and either kept as a leftover or disposed of, and a lot of the food waste would occur there. So the chapter explores the whole process really, and a variety of other literature available on that topic. In reheating, in the chapter on reheating, this one specifically looks at households, because in FBOs we didn't have that many occurrences of reheating practices, at least not enough to discuss in great detail anyway. So in households, we found that knowledge and understanding were a significant barrier for people in terms of understanding best practice. So people didn't know how they should safely reheat food, or what types of food they can and can't reheat. And actually a lot of myths came out about this, about people thinking you can and can't reheat certain types of food. They also didn't understand why they needed to reheat food until steaming hot. So it was particularly a barrier that people recognise you could eat leftovers when they're cold and fresh from the fridge, or when they're steaming hot, but they couldn't really understand why they couldn't just have them lukewarm. And in some cases, people just preferred to eat them lukewarm. They didn't want to burn themselves and they didn't want to eat them cold. We also found that people had interesting beliefs about food safety here. So particularly that raw food is often considered to be a high risk food, and people are more careful around this. But when it comes to leftovers, people know that the food has already been cooked, and so they don't understand why reheating is so important for food safety. It's just considered less important than it would be in a raw setting, for example. Our chapter on use by date, this one explored, obviously, whether or not people checked or consumed food past the use by date. This one is slightly different in that it's actually very difficult to observe whether or not somebody is looking at a use by date, because of course when you look at a packaging for a food item, it's really hard to tell if people are reading the use by date or the cooking instructions or something else on the label. So a lot of findings from this chapter are actually based on the self-reported parts of the study, so the survey and interview data mostly. The findings in this chapter show that households often use smell, appearance, and sometimes the taste of food to determine whether a food was safe to eat, and instead of relying on the use by date. In FBOs, generally, they were actually quite strict with use by dates, and they did want, as I mentioned earlier, to prevent food waste. So it wasn't as much of an issue in food businesses. However, where it was more of a concern was that there was a bit of a culture in the kitchen around the chef being considered to be a very experienced person, a member of staff, and therefore they could rely on his intuition about whether or not food was safe to eat past the use by date. And this was despite the fact that most staff in FBOs knew that use by dates were important and they understood why they were there, but they still relied on the chef and kind of respected him as a trusted member of staff to judge whether food was safe to eat. And then in our final chapter on chopping boards, this one focused about the reuse of chopping boards, particularly when chopping boards were reused for the preparation of meat, fish or poultry, and then followed by the preparation of other foods on the same board. But actually, the chapter explains that it wasn't very common for people to do this. It wasn't common for people to prepare something raw and then prepare something on the same board without washing it that was cooked or ready to eat. It did happen, but it wasn't that frequent. In fact, the chapter actually explores how it was much more common for a board to be used for preparation of meat, fish or poultry. And then instead of being washed straight away, the board would be left around the kitchen. And I think we've noted here that they become like forgotten boards. They're left on the draining board or in the sink, or they become part of the work surface. And people start to use them as part of the kitchen space. So, for example, we saw people resting their utensils on them. And in a few occasions, we saw people serving. So they would put their dinner plates on them and actually serve their dinner at the end of the meal preparation to give out to people. So the board becomes part of the kitchen, and this is where the cross-contamination risk lies. So that's an overview of all of the other chapters, just to give you a kind of an overview and to kind of whet your appetite to go and have a look at those. So before we close and open up to questions, I also just wanted to outline the range of outputs that we have available for this study. There's a variety of resources for you to go and explore, and you can find a lot more information via this web link that we've attached to this slide. So we have, firstly, data tables. These are publicly available via our website, our data catalogue, and soon they're going to be available via the UK data service as well. Obviously, the data set is huge. As I mentioned, over 290,000 data labels with timestamping and thermometer data. So a really good resource for anybody who would like to delve deeper into that and do their own their own research. We also have the 7 behavioural chapters that we've discussed today. So each one provides an in-depth commentary on a specific behaviour. They include CONV analysis, quantitative data, and of course the case studies as well. We have our technical report. So for anybody that's interested in the methodology, the ethics, the legal side of the research, that's all available for you in our technical report. Soon to come, our partners at Leeds University Business School intend to publish an academic paper about the study in a journal. They have also authored the literature review, which is available on our website. And then for those of you at the FSA, and apologies to those of you that aren't and don't have access to these final 2 items, we also have 2 additional resources. Firstly, we have a dashboard which allows users to manipulate the data and look at features across the data set, such as the number of kitchens that have a pet. And yes, we did also capture pets because the cameras were motion sensitive. And the type of demographic information about those kitchens. Additionally, we also have a sequence analysis tool, which allows users to manipulate the data and look at specific examples of behaviours occurring using timestamping. So, for instance, you can use this data set to look at when behaviour like handling meat occurs, and then how long it takes people to then go and do their hand washing. Okay, so I suppose it just leaves me to say thank you very much for joining this session today, and we really hope you've enjoyed exploring the findings with us. Both myself and Darren would be happy to take any questions that you might have. I think if you post them in the chat, we'll try and answer as many as we can. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's back over to me to host the Q&A session. So firstly, thank you so much, Helen and Darren, for a fantastic presentation. It's really interesting, particularly seeing some of the case studies and how people are actually behaving at home and in FBOs. We've got quite a lot of questions that have come through, actually, so I will start them off. There were a couple of questions which were kind of in a similar vein. So we had one question from Charlotte asking, how did you account for people adjusting their behaviour because they knew they were being observed? And we also had a very similar question from someone asking around the presence of cameras and whether that would have an effect on people's behaviour. So just wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
I mean, I'm happy to take it. No method's perfect. Inevitably, there would have been some influence, but it's almost impossible and cognitively exhausting to be conscious of this all the time. And so many behaviours in kitchens are in the moment, subconscious. So, I mean, what we generally observed is that people were really quite occasionally conscious of it, but you could just tell by how they're acting, by watching that footage, that they most of the time they'd forgotten about it, and particularly after the first couple of hours of being there, because there are a lot more in the moment things distracting you, kids and cooking and other things. We also saw certain things which would very strongly suggest that people weren't conscious of being filmed. I won't go into what those were. So yes, my gut feel is it had a minor effect in some instances. It probably had a momentary effect in some instances, but as a whole, it had a fairly minimal effect.
Thanks, Darren. We've got quite a few more questions coming in as well. So there's one question which I think has been answered, which was around whether the data is publicly available for exploration. So as Helen said, there's some data tables which are published. But as part of the same question, someone's asked whether any regression analysis has been carried out to find the socio-demographic factors of non-compliance at all.
We didn't look at the social in the main study. I know that some folks at Leeds are looking at stuff. I mean, one thing to be mindful of is, whilst there's a lot of data, the actual sample isn't huge. So I'd be very cautious about that sort of analysis. We've run various correlations looking at the links between various behaviours. We did also look at that via demographic factors, but we've not included that for that reason. I don't know, Helen, if there are other things you want to add in that context from other work that's currently being underdone.
No, I was just going to say exactly the same in terms of sample size. So as Darren said, the number of kitchens included in the study is relatively low. For qualitative research, it's extraordinarily high. Actually, 101 kitchens is a huge amount. And the number of data labels that we can apply, and obviously the data is very rich and in depth. So there is a lot there, but as Darren says, the sample size and representation is low. So I don't think it would be fair to make broader generalizations from the data. But the data is publicly available if people do want to explore it more. Yeah.
Thank you both. Okay, we've got a couple of other questions around tea towels. So one question was from Amy, which was asking, did any of these behaviours, especially with tea towel cross-contamination, result in illness? I think I know the answer, but do you want to jump in? And...
Not as far as I'm aware. No, I don't know. It's the short answer. I don't know. Yeah, we weren't looking at those sorts of outcomes through the research.
Yeah, no longitudinal study. There was no longitudinal part to this study, so we didn't continue to monitor people to see if they became ill. It's actually a bit of a shame in that one of our hopes and aspirations for the project very early on was to do microbiological swabbing in kitchens as part of the study design. For various reasons that wasn't possible in the end, and mostly because we started during COVID-19 and people were a bit busy swabbing other things during that time, and there were no swabs left for us to swab in kitchens, which of course is fair enough. But so unfortunately not, but it would be very interesting to compare the findings from Kitchen Life 2 with other research that maybe has conducted swabbing of that nature, so that we can really see the impact that these behaviours might be having in terms of people's real health.
Thanks, Helen. And I think you've answered one of the other questions as well, which came in, which was around whether any sampling had been done or surface swabbing. So the answer to that is no, but that would have been really interesting. We had another question on tea towels. So somebody said it would be interesting to see how hygienic a towel was when it smells. Sounds that cross-contamination could be happening prior to smells setting in. Did anyone look into this?
So, I mean, the intervention was actually based a lot more on wetness rather than smells. We haven't, again, looked into it from a microbiological perspective. Obviously, when things are wet, the opportunity for those microbes to breed increases. But I think it was what we were really trying to get to is just how completely unconscious most of those behaviours were. So it's really, really hard when something is proximate and near to hand and unconscious. How do you disrupt that? And this was the only thing that really did seem to cut through. It's that sensorial cue, that yuck factor that it kind of broke people out of those moments. So none of these have been fully worked up into interventions yet. These were just hypotheses about where territories might be that could be thought about in a bit more depth.
Great, thank you. There are a couple of questions around people's behaviour following the study. So one question was asking, at what point was there any intervention? Were participants made aware of the correct guidance or that their behaviours were risky? And do we know if participants changed their behaviours following the study?
You want me to answer that one, Darren?
Feel free. Yeah.
So no, we didn't intervene. It's really important actually that we didn't, because that's the whole purpose of the research, is to observe as close to real life as possible in people in their real homes or real businesses. So we did not intervene during. It's also actually a legal part of when we set up the study that we can't intervene. So as a regulator, the FSA obviously is responsible for, being involved with the regulation of businesses. But actually, this research was conducted for the legal basis of research only, and that means we can't use it to regulate or intervene. So that actually created quite a neat barrier for us, where we could not overstep that mark. We could observe and report and analyse the behaviours, but we could not change what people were doing. Obviously, there's a debate around that, right, about whether that is ethical or not. But I think it's important to remember that we are observing what is already existing and already happening, and by not getting involved, we're not changing behaviour either way. I don't know about whether or not people changed their behaviour following the study. That's not something we specifically set out to check. Darren, do you have any reflections from your interview experience with participants?
As subtle as my interview techniques are, I think people could kind of think, oh, can you just tell me a bit more about such and such? Maybe guessing that that was a problem. I mean, we set up the interviews to say, irrespective of whether you adopt a behaviour or not, we ask this of everybody, and we're just interested in that context. So we weren't trying to give stuff away. I think nonetheless, people were more conscious of certain things. The extent to which that's then gone on to influence anything, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. One thing I would add as well, actually, particularly in food businesses, if anybody asked specifically for further support or advice about food safety, we would always be able to direct them to information provided by the FSA on our website. So there was a degree of support available to people if it was requested.
Thank you both. Still got quite a few questions that have come through, sorry. So one was around FBOs. So someone has asked whether there was any relationship with proximity or ease of access to a sink when it came to washing hands, and whether that could be a point of intervention. So I'm not sure if you've got anything on that.
We didn't. So at a total data set level, it was too complex to get into that. We did look at it on a more of a case by case. So when we were analysing the data within certain businesses, we focused on behaviours of interest, and then we re-watched all of the footage related to that behaviour. So we were looking at that in that context. I mean, the reality is that there are so many other things going on. Even if you're nearby, something can be in a way, like a table. Sometimes the sinks are full of other stuff. I think the bigger barrier is actually the proximity of the tea towel, which is often being used in preference, and no one had a sink on their shoulder. So it's my hunch is it probably did to some extent, but not to the extent that you might imagine. And it was most places within fairly easy reach of an individual, i.e. within the field of view of the camera, which was probably no more than 15-20 feet. The sink was there, so it wasn't that someone was needing to walk halfway across the premises to wash their hands.
Thanks, Darren. We've still got quite a few questions, but conscious we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'll just read out a couple more, and then perhaps if your question doesn't get answered today, please do feel free to get in touch, and I'll put some details in the chat for the Food for Thought team, and we can get back to you via email. So I'll just cover a couple of more. One was around pets, which I think you touched on, Helen, in your slides, but someone asked if you recorded or gathered any info on pets in households and feeding them.
Yeah, so obviously motion sensitive cameras, right? So as soon as a pet comes in, the camera comes on. And we did observe pets in kitchens. We did code for that. So we do have information in our data set about pets in the kitchen, and you could explore the data from that perspective. We ultimately didn't write a chapter on it because for the FSA at the time, it wasn't a key focus for us, and we instead decided to focus on the other chapters mentioned. But yeah, lots of interesting behaviours from the pets. Darren, do you have any particular reflections on that?
I'll give you a tip. Don't leave uncovered takeaways in a kitchen, and leave the kitchen when your pet is about.
Lots of cheeky cats on surfaces, lots of dogs, on counters, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we'll have to wrap it up there. Just to also say there's quite a few comments in the chat saying thank you, what a great presentation, and people asking if there'll be a recording available. So just to confirm, we will be posting the recording on our YouTube channel. So we'll be sending this round, and I can pop it in the chat as well. And also just to flag, if you're not signed up to Food for Thought and you would like to be signed up, then you can sign up via a link which I'll pop in the chat, and also email us at foodforthought for thought at food.gov.uk. Also, if you are at the FSA and you're interested in volunteering and being part of the Food for Thought team, then please do also get in touch. So thank you so much for joining. Have a nice rest of the day. And then let me just pop this in the chat now before we sign off. Any final remarks from Helen or Darren at all?
No, just to say thank you for everybody for joining. And we're really pleased that you've enjoyed the session. Darren?
Yeah, I mean, it's a project that will stay with me forever for all sorts of reasons. It was quite an amazing experience. So thank you to the FSA for having the courage to go ahead.
That's great, thank you. I'm just putting the final link in the chat before we close, link to sign up, and I've just put the Food for Thought into the Q&A chat as well. So that should be everything you need. For any questions, just get in touch. Thank you so much, Helen and Darren, and thanks to everyone for joining today. Have a good rest of the day.